and I'm going to be serving as our chair and person helping with moderating afterwards. My name is Colleen Barrett. I'm the Rare Books Librarian at the University of Kentucky's Special Collections Research Center, but more importantly here, I'm the administrator of the King Library Press, which is a bibliographic teaching press we've had in the basement of our library for about 70 years. We're going to start this session with Breanne Weber giving a talk on inscribing bodies and ecologies through bookmaking. She is a postdoctoral college fellow in the engagements at the University of Virginia, where she teaches bibliography, book history, and book arts as epistemological practice. Her co-edited collection, Playbook Wills, 1529 to 1690, is forthcoming from Manchester University Press. She's also writing a monograph on the materiality of inscriptive metaphors in early modern British literature and their impact upon conceptions of the human body, the book, and the environment in 16th and 17th century England. Following her talk, Dylan Lewis will continue with Pressing Identities, Embodied Identity, and the book arts. In addition to serving as the new managing editor of PBSA, Dylan's a PhD candidate at the University of Maryland, where he studies book history, bibliography, print culture, printer media, and 7th and 18th century literature. He also works as a graduate instructor at the UMD Book Lab. His dissertation investigates the gendered, sexualized, and racialized history of typecasting, typeface design, ornamentation, and typographic layout in 17th and 18th century print through a queer studies lens. He's presented his work on book history and bibliography, both nationally and internationally, and he's published with PBSA, Sharp News, and Early Modern Female Book Ownership. We will finish the session with Caden Henningsen giving us a talk titled Embodied Knowledge is in the Press Room, or A Waltz with Walt. Caden is currently a PhD candidate in the Department of English at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign, where he's writing a trans history of the book in 19th century America. His scholarship has appeared in Library Trends, Modern Feminist Forum, and Criticism. You're also an award-winning printer and book artist and the owner of Meanwhile Letterpress. His work is included in several collections, including the Bainbridge Museum of Art, Houghton Library, King Library at the University of Kentucky, and the Library of Congress. So.
And APHA individual.
Oh yes. Also.
Sorry to embarrass you, Kaden, but it's exciting.
Yeah. So if you have time on Saturday and you want to come to the AFA meeting, which will be in the Center for the Book Arts, Caden will be winning an award. And also thank them for sponsoring us tonight by having a space. Great. I'm going to disappear for a while.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
All right, can everyone hear me okay? Yes. All right, great. Okay, so in 1655, Welsh physician and poet Henry Vaughan published Silex Intellens II, a collection of his religious poetry. One of the poems contained therein, entitled The Book, outlines nearly the entire cycle of a book's creation and a beautiful poetic record of the early English bookmaking process. From the seed that would become paper to the beast whose skin would become its leather cover, the components of the book and their past lives are situated here as part of an ecosystem that reminds the speaker of his own place within it, created from the dust of the earth, much like the elements of the natural world that become book parts. I won't read the entire poem, but I would like to draw your attention to a few moments where Vaughan conflates producer and product. That is, those who contribute parts to a material book and the book object itself, as he praises God for his loving care. The speaker accomplishes this through repetition of the phrase, "Thou knewest this." First, "Thou knewest this paper when it was mere seed, and after that but grass. Before 'twas dressed or spun, and when made linen, who did wear it then? Then we move to the trees. Thou knewest this tree when a green shade covered it, since a cover made. And finally, thou knewest this harmless beast when he did live and feed by thy decree on each green thing, then slept, well fed, clothed with the skin which now lies spread a covering o'er this aged book." In each occurrence, the speaker notes a part of the book and its contributor. First, the flax and hemp seeds that become paper. Then he notes the tree whose wood becomes cover boards, and finally the animals whose skin becomes the leather binding. By repeating the word "this" in conjunction with the list of raw materials, the speaker refers to the book in which the poem is printed as its component parts, each knowable by God. This flax paper, this tree cover, this harmless beast binding, this refers to the book object we hold in our hands while reading the poem, The Book. For Von Speaker, the book is an ecosystem whereby each of these component parts and their contributors are dependent upon each other to create the whole. Yet they are each independently knowable and restorable to their original forms at the day of judgment. I begin with the book because, as a scholar of 16th and 17th century British literature, I have long been struck by Vaughan's intimate knowledge of the bookmaking process and how starkly it stands in comparison to what we tend to know now. In an increasingly digital age where so many of us are distanced from the tacit knowledge of how our most meaningful objects, like our books, are made, Vaughan's poem is a stark reminder of how our books are ecosystems, where each contributor to its creation, the material book itself, and ourselves are bound up in the assemblage that is a book. It is for this reason that my book project, Ecologies of Inscription in Early Modern England, considers bookmaking as an ecological process that alters everyone involved, from plants to people, and how that perspective influences literary approaches to the book as both a material object and a metaphor. And I would not have come to this view of the process without the contemporary book arts. For the remainder of this short talk, I'd thus like to walk you through how the book arts, in particular letterpress printing, has shaped the course of my scholarly work. Before I discuss the role that the book arts has played in shaping my research, though, I'd like to situate this talk through a brief overview of my book. In Ecologies of Inscription, I contend that William Shakespeare, Mary Wroth, and other early modern writers portray the processes of textual inscription, primarily with pens and knives, as crucial for the formation of identity, as these processes intimately and at times violently situate the self against a gendered, racialized, or non-human other. Rather than focus on the theorization of inscription as a more abstracted form of linguistic signification, I have found that approaching the concept of inscription as an inherently material and ecological process better underscores the implications of inscriptive acts that occur in literature of the 16th and 17th centuries. I take up Andrea Bachner's assertion that inscription acts as an interface between text and body, arguing then that materializing inscriptive and other bookmaking metaphors in early modern texts is crucial for understanding the ways that many historically excluded groups were in fact important contributors to early English book culture. When I began writing the first draft of Ecologies of Inscription, which was at the time my dissertation, I had not yet begun to experiment with the book arts. I was familiar with the historical processes from my studies in the abstract, but I didn't know what a Vandercook proof press was, nor had I ever hand-bound a book or set type myself. The bookmaking process was wholly theoretical. So when I first started to assemble my project's archive, including texts like Shakespeare's As You Like It, Christopher Marlowe's Dr. Faustus, and the Lady Mary Roth's Urania, I had no idea how nuanced and detailed the author's knowledge of bookmaking actually was, nor what the larger implications of that tacit understanding could be for their works and early modern literature as a whole. Funnily enough, I didn't start making books to further my research. I initially took up book arts as a hobby, buying a little bookbinding kit to give myself a break from the research grind on the weekends. And once I started, I couldn't stop, as it goes. Because I was in the Bay Area in California, I had access to a wealth of book arts resources to draw upon, from the San Francisco Center for the Book, where I became certified to print independently on their presses, to the historic mid-19th century Columbian iron hand press in the basement of Shields Library on UC Davis's campus. I had no shortage of opportunities to try my hand at both historical and contemporary printing practices. As I crafted, I realized very quickly that my art was changing the way I thought about my research project. In particular, taking the letterpress certification course at SFCB is really what altered my approach to early modern bookmaking metaphors. In particular, the concept of inscription, which until that point I had never considered to be wholly different from other forms of transferring or translating text on a page, like impression. One of the projects I had to complete for my letterpress certification was a broadside, and I, ambitious to a fault, decided to typeset an entire 17th century manuscript recipe for cake from the Folger Shakespeare Library's digital collection. If you have ever set type, you know that this is a massive undertaking. It ended up taking 1.5 days of the certification process because I was mentally transcribing the document backwards and upside down into a composing stick and couldn't check my work very easily. For context, everyone else was printing 2 to 3 lines of poetry or song, and I was doing this. It was a painstaking process to set and transfer the type to the bed, lock it in, measure and check all of my margins, and create the impression on the printed page. Through the process, which I'd like to remind you was supposed to be a break from my research, it became evident that I had been conflating the act of impression with the act of inscription in my scholarly work, considering all of these acts under the umbrella of bookmaking, despite them having wildly different processes and stakes for the writers I am studying. Because while inscription can refer to print and is certainly a crucial part of the bookmaking process, what I tacitly understood through this process is that printing is impressing. An impression is reciprocal. A piece of inked type kissing paper leaves the ink on the paper in the form of the letter, but also with repeated impressions wears down the lead type. Inscription, on the other hand, requires some form of penetration with a knife or a pen in the period that both distinguishes us as separate from and part of the thing we are inscribing. It's erotic, embodied, and highly intimate and agential in a way that impression doesn't seem to be in some early modern texts. Again, I knew this in theory, but the actual practice helped me parse a tension between these two practices that I was seeing in the prose romance on which I was writing my first chapter, the Lady Mary Wroth's Urania. Before I outline this tension and its stakes, a little bit of context. Wroth was the niece of prominent Elizabethan poets Sir Philip Sidney and Mary Sidney Herbert. You may be familiar with Sidney's sonnet sequence Astrophil and Stella, which was the first written in English vernacular. A member of this famously literary family and its coterie culture, Wroth was not only intimately familiar with the developing generic conventions of vernacular poetry and prose, but she was also highly aware of the difficulties of being a woman writer pursuing publication at the time. Wroth's work challenges literary convention by centering female desire, turning one of her main characters, Pamphylia, into the spurned lover-turned-pining poet who inscribes her melancholic love poetry about her male lover into trees, onto papers in her closet, and even her own heart in a dream sequence. What I had not realized when reading Wroth's work is that while Pamphylia certainly creates a lot of text across the 1,400 or so pages of the Urania, Wroth makes a clear distinction between the acts of inscription and impression and shows how they have very different outcomes for Pamphylia. For instance, on the subject of impression, in a fit of melancholy, pining over her lover's rejection, Pamphylia wanders into her garden, which features a purling, murmuring, sad brook weeping away her, Pamphylia's, sorrows. The narrator describes the setting in fine detail, noting the flowers and bushes, hills and valleys, and groves of trees, environed with such unusual variety of excellent pleasures as she had a heart to receive delight from anything but love. She might have taken pleasure in that place. Despite the beauty and appeal of the environment and the way that it has been impressed with Pamphylia's own melancholy, the narrator clarifies that Pamphylia does not take pleasure in the garden, merely occasions to increase sorrow, love being so cruel as to turn pleasures in this nature to the contrary course. For Pamphylia, nature has been transformed by her unrequited love, yet remains unable to leave any sort of impression upon her, which is what she wants. She wants her pain to be lessened by reciprocated sharing, and it doesn't work. She herself even physically attempts to impress herself and her woe upon the grass and force the reciprocal nature of impression to leave a mark on her. And now, poor grass, she says, thou shalt suffer for my pain, my love-smarting body thus pressing thee. Then laid she her excelling self upon that then most blessed ground. Pamphylia envisions impressing her pain and misery into the grass, trying to use her body as part of the metaphorical machinery of print, but it is to no avail. Wroth then immediately juxtaposes this failed impression against a successful inscription. Pamphylia inscribes a sonnet into the bark of an ash tree, a hardwood with folkloric history in the British Isles, considered protective and healing to those who have established a bond with one. The sonnet reads as follows: Bear part with me, most straight and pleasant tree, and imitate the torments of my smart, which cruel love doth send into my heart. Keep in thy skin this testament of me, which love engraven hath with misery, cutting with grief the unresisting part, which would with pleasure soon have learned love's art, but wounds still cureless must my rulers be. Thy sap doth weepingly bewray thy pain, thy heart blood drops with storms it doth sustain. Love senseless neither good nor mercy knows. Pitiless I do wound thee, while that I, unpitied and unthought on, wounded cry. Then outlive me and testify my woes. Pamphylia's bond with the ash is clearly established through this act of inscription, in a way that the grass impression attempt is not. She acknowledges the violence of her actions, carving with her penknife the tree's unresisting part, the language of which could imply both that it has no agency, but also that it does and is choosing not to resist. This is especially plausible given the fact that as a hardwood, The ash's bark should be a bit resistant to carving, yet it isn't. Even so, the unstopped final line of quatrain 1 ends not with a period, but with a colon, directly following the word me. The punctuation implies that Pamphylia is describing not the tree, but herself. The boundaries between human body, tree, and engraven word are blurred. What follows the colon in line 4 describes Pamphylia and her mental state just as much as it describes the tree, which love engraven hath with misery, cutting with grief the unresisting heart, which would with pleasure soon have learned love's art, but wounds still cureless must my rulers be. The misery with which love engraves and cuts, and the unresisting part itself, refer through this complex syntactical arrangement both to Pamphylia's actions toward the tree and love's actions toward Pamphylia. Pamphylia's sonnet also breaks convention, moving the rhymed couplet, which is typically at the end if there is one at all, to the middle of the poem. Its placement is crucial to understanding Pamphylia's inscriptive actions and her ecological relationship with the tree. By building this couplet immediately after the poem's turn, Wroth draws attention to the message of those two lines. Thy sap doth weepingly bewray thy pain, my heart blood drops with storms it doth sustain. The sonnet's central tension is the relationship between Pamphylia's feelings and those of the ash tree she is bonded with. Wroth thus situates the entanglement of human and tree identities via the mingling of bodily fluids as central to the poems and by extension the situation's meaning. Pamphylia's heart blood is directly juxtaposed against the ash tree's sap, which is cast as tears, her feminine emotion cast not as fragility but as an empowering and slightly masochistic storm. Further, Wroth uses this tightly rhymed couplet to unite Pamphylia and the tree in an almost marriage-like sense, their two distinct beings becoming one. This is a perfect example of how inscription acts as an interface, as I said at the beginning, a differentiating and a uniting process that distinguishes us as both one with and different from the object we are creating. By embedding this message into her subversion of the sonnet form itself, Wroth indicates that the entanglements that inscriptive acts illuminate are not just figurative, but material and embodied. It was ultimately my foray into the world of book arts that helped me develop a more nuanced understanding of this tension that Wroth sets up between inscription and impression in the Urania. In learning to operate a letterpress, I became better able to see the stakes of properly materializing these literary references to bookmaking. In these two examples, the environment is given some agency, and as a result, both Pamphylia and the ash tree are forever changed. Pamela Smith argues that, quote, craft can be investigative and not just productive, end quote. And that has been true in my experience. What craft has done for my research is illuminate the intimacy of artistic process and how certain creative actions, like inscription, collapse the distance between producer and product in the ways that Wroth portrays. Approaching the material book from this perspective then allows us to both recover missing contributors to established traditions and also to revise our understanding of the past in ways that help us move toward a more inclusive future. Thank you. I tried so hard to fiddle with it, and it wasn't working.
Do you want to give it a try?
I'll probably be fine without it,
Okay.
but
Yeah.
I think I'll be fine without it.
It works when, weird.
Yeah,
Yeah,
it's
it
like
works
you
when you tap on it and you
doesn't-
speak
And
and
then
it's
when you
silent.
speak into it. it's-
Yeah, I'll probably be fine. Nobody's told me I'm too quiet before. So.
You know what I think it is actually, you just have to speak directly in the mic. Yeah, so just point it towards.
This is okay.
Yay. Don't move.
I will be as still as possible during this talk. Okay, so hopefully this cuts out, or it doesn't cut out. If it cuts out, I'll just put it down and move on. First, though, I wanted to start with a couple of thanks and acknowledgements, because these are also part of how I do bibliographical work. So I wanted to start by thanking Colleen Barrett for organizing the panel. I was really thrilled, and yeah, thanks to Colleen. I was really thrilled and honored to participate when she reached out to me. I'm really excited, a fair bit nervous. This is my first bibliography week, and so I'm happy to be here in New York. I also wanted to extend my gratitude to Erin and the Bibliographical Society of America for their support, as well as the Center for Book Arts. for hosting us tonight. This is quite possibly one of the best venues in the world to be here discussing the book arts. So it's rare as an academic that you get to give a talk in like one of the best venues for the talk. I'm recalling a conference I was at where the only way that we could get to my conference room was like cutting through the hotel restaurant, which was not an ideal venue, so I'm really thankful to be here at such a nice place for this talk. I also wanted to thank my two co-panelists. They're not only colleagues, but they're both friends, so it's really nice to be sitting here between them in conversation tonight. So for my talk, I'd like to discuss a few different threads that I've been tugging at recently concerning the intersections of bibliography, the book arts, and queerness. These are threads that to me have always been complexly intertwined despite the relative lack of scholarship that attends explicitly to their connections and overlaps. And I currently work in a variety of professional capacities that engage with these intersections. I teach courses at the University of Maryland on book history, bibliography, and queer media. I work as an instructor and an assistant in our English department's Book Arts Makerspace book lab, and I'm currently dissertating on print history and queer typography in the hand press period. My teaching, maker, and book arts projects and my more traditional scholarship on typography all inform how I approach bibliographical work. And I came to the field of bibliography from my experience with letterpress, printing, and the book arts first, and these perspectives have shaped how I see myself as a bibliographer, as well as how I study books. I've been really encouraged by the adoption of various book arts and bibliomaking approaches as bibliography in recent years, rather than seeing them as separate fields, and I've been honored to help contribute to these conversations. Some of my recent work in the newly emerging subfield of queer bibliography, as well as the work of my colleagues who attended our inaugural Queer Bibliography Symposium last year in London, is interrogating traditional bibliographical methodologies and thinking about bibliography in the 21st century. What would bibliography look like if recent intersectional interventions from Black, feminist, and queer bibliography were better integrated in the field? One of the reoccurring themes of the symposium was the importance of our identities in shaping our scholarship, as well as the importance of affect in bibliographical work. Bibliography, just like the book arts, is an embodied practice. Books have material impacts and they function in translation of embodied experiences. Thinking about what we... Now I got really loud. All right. Books have material impacts and they function in translation of embodied experiences. Thinking about what we might refer to as the queer corporality of books enables us to consider the ways various design features, aesthetic presentations, or construction methods reject notions of normalcy, despite bibliography's interest in essentialization. The field of analytical bibliography, for example, is predominantly interested in analyzing books to see what their material forms tell us about their printing history. One of the lessons then bibliography might learn from the book arts is the centrality of embodied experiences and the role that identity and affect play in mediating them. This has been important in my scholarship, and it's also been central in my pedagogy as an instructor of queer media and the book arts. My work with letterpress printing as an undergraduate was my first exposure to the fields of book history and bibliography, as my university was fortunate enough to have a fairly well-equipped letterpress studio. And my continued forays into printing and other aspects of the book arts taught me a lot that came in handy when I started reading more traditional bibliographical scholarship. For example, I feel like my first slog through Philip Gaskell's A New Introduction to Bibliography would have been even more difficult without the letterpress experience I already possessed. On the flip note, some of the things that seem quite easy when you read Gaskell, when you have letterpress experience, you actually find it's quite difficult to do that in the press, so there's a kind of interesting tension there. While I was no means a great letterpress printer when I started dipping my toes into bibliography, my own tactile experience in the bed of a press taught me a lot about what I was seeing when I looked at the hand-pressed books that I study. In my role now as an instructor, both in courses I teach as well as in my capacity as an assistant at my Book Arts Makerspace book lab, I continue to engage students in thinking bibliographically about books through experiential hands-on approaches with various book arts activities. If one of the aims of bibliographical analysis is to examine how texts were produced, the effects of their design and layout features, and how a text materiality conveys meaning, book arts work in a classroom, library, or makerspace is an extremely effective way to get students thinking about some of these questions. Rather than passively analyzing the book, students must engage physically with questions about format, design, binding, and other components to produce their project. Helping students make bibliographical connections and observations about their book work is central to what I do at Book Lab. Students work with a variety of materials and technologies to study bibliography and the book arts through analytical and tactile means, such as a Glowforge laser cutter, a Cricut cutting machine, a tabletop 3D printer, paper sensors and other bibliocircuitry tools, 7 different tabletop presses for letterpress printing, and multiple shelves of bookbinding and crafting supplies. For many of the students who use our space, especially queer students, embracing no-stakes play, unpredictability, and the possibility of failure in the creation of their own material texts enables them to conceive of books, one of the most ubiquitous and recognizable objects in the world, as queer objects. Those of us who work in the space are actively invested in queer approaches to book history, bibliography, and the book arts, too, through our ethos of creativity and experimentation as a counter to the rigidity and traditionalism that continue to dominate both bibliography and letterpress printing. Book Lab co-director Matthew Kirschenbaum has said, quote, "We are opening the space for a more affective response to books. Queering bibliography helps to foreground those absences and gaps and what is ultimately knowable and recoverable from the past," end quote. Many of our graduate student assistants and undergrad interns, past and present, also identify as queer, which suggests a connection between queerness and the book arts that has yet to be comprehensively explored by scholars. This past semester, we had a handful of undergraduate interns working in the space who completed various book arts projects of their own interest. Some of those are shown here on the slides. The students received little formal training and were instead encouraged to experiment with various methods and techniques. When recounting what she learned over the course of the internship, one of our interns, Maddie Breanne, told me, quote, "A book can be anything. There might be guides of what a book is, but you can really do whatever you want with a book. That seems very queer," and gave me a place to explore the random ideas that I have without judgment. Book Lab was a great no judgment area where I felt like I could be myself and come into my queerness through books, end quote. Interrogating books through these tactile and amateur means enables students, as Book Lab co-director Carrie Krause has argued, to, quote, "discover the fault lines in objects, artifacts, or systems being explored, and in doing so allows us to imagine them otherwise, to see them as alterable rather than immutable, as possibility spaces rather than rigid inherited structures," end quote. As Maddie testified, the bookish possibility spaces opened up through creative book arts work maps directly onto identity. This ethos creates space for queer students and informs new epistemologies of what it means to make a text and study it as it is rather than how it should have been, giving students a place where they feel comfortable expressing an identity that might not always be welcomed or encouraged in other institutionalized spaces. Such a perspective works counter to the essentialized understandings of books one finds in traditional bibliographical scholarship, and enabling students to make these connections has also helped me make similar connections in my own scholarship, which relies on de-essentializing books and their various elements, as well as seeing identity as a major component of textual materiality. Such makerspace approaches have also taken on new political identities in the face of academia's neoliberalization. What scholar Natalie Lovelace terms as research creation serves as, quote, "a strategy of resistance that works to trouble disciplinary relays of knowledge and power, allowing for a more creative, sensually attuned modes of inhabiting the university as a vibrant location of pedagogical mattering," end quote. Centering pedagogical mattering in research creation and bibliographical analysis emphasizes both the importance of materiality in the study of books as objects, as well as the affective power associated with creating things that matter to the students who put their time and energy into the object's creation. Our intern Maddie also spoke of the role of emotion and feelings in her book arts work. She said, quote, "I'm 100% connected to the works I make emotionally. My projects this semester played a really important part of me coming back to joy and confidence and creativity," end quote. While affect has long been excluded from bibliography, many of us in the field study books particularly because of the feelings we have about them, or as J.D. Sargan puts it, book historians and bibliographers should, quote, "acknowledge, reflect on, and sit with the fact that, perhaps more than any other discipline, we choose our objects of study because of the affective relationships we have with them. Book historians love books. In denying our affective responses to the books we study, we inhibit a critical tool that could otherwise serve us," end quote. For those of us who are queer and work on queer bibliography, for example, our identities and our feelings are inextricable from the scholarship that we do. In my queer media course this past semester, I assigned students a project to make an 8-page zine that represented their identity. We had just finished reading Jordy Rosenberg's Confessions of the Fox, a speculative and historical metafictional novel which retells the story of 18th century thief Jack Sheppard as a trans man. Quoted as an epigraph in the beginning of the novel is an excerpt of a poem by John Donne, which states, quote, "Love's mysteries and souls do grow, but yet the body is his book," end quote. The process of being inscribed and reinscribed by love is a central theme throughout the novel, and students enjoyed thinking about Jack's body as a book, since the course had focused a lot on textuality and materiality in other units too. The zine exercise, where they imagined how their body or identity could be registered as a book, was a natural extension of this conversation. Many of the zines were more conventional, like this first example's cover, which used magazine cutouts to represent human figures as flowers, emphasizing the student's argument that growth is central to her identity, saying, quote, "Lots of queer people rediscover themselves when they're older, or they grow into themselves iteratively," end quote. But several of the zines embraced unconventional materials and methods to take seriously the task of representing their identity and perhaps even their body through the form of their small book. For example, one student used tissue paper, and this is the example on the right. One student used tissue paper, writing that, quote, "I made my zine on tissue paper because of how fragile the material is. I had to be more careful carrying it to the classroom and gluing the tissue and magazine cutouts. This creation process mirrors my autistic brain. My zine is about my life progression as an autistic person. My brain is overly systematic and action planning in order to compensate for my awkward limbs and social anxiety. My clumsy nature couldn't avoid me spilling my roommate's juice on my zine and his homework, and I had to redo several pages after they were destroyed. The constant writing and rewriting of this zine reflects how I have to write and rewrite myself every day as I navigate difficult social experiences," end quote. In imagining their bodies as books, students were highly attuned not only to questions about content, but also the forms of their books. In other words, they saw bibliographical work as a direct reflection of their own embodied experiences. My dissertation is a queer reading of typography from the hand press period, arguing that typography has always been involved in discussions of identity, particularly race, gender, and sexuality, in a way that hasn't been comprehensively explored from queer perspectives. And my work with the book arts has given me a lot of insight into this project. Typography is one of the first elements of a text that disappears in bibliographical scholarship, despite being the most obviously visible component. For example, in his Principles of Bibliographic Description, Bauer states that, quote, "As the final paragraph in the actual description of the book, the most intensive bibliographies may add a note on typography. This matter has no significance to students of literature, but constitutes a part of the book's printing history, and on occasion may help to date the text." My own queer perspectives on identity as someone who grew up gay in Texas and had to hide who I was for a considerable period of my life drives my interest in investigating what we might call the closeted identities of typography. For example, early humanist typographical treatises like Luca Pacioli and Leonardo da Vinci's 1509 Divina Proporzione, or Geoffrey Torrey's 1529 Champfleury, represent how letters are integrated with everyday human experiences by centering letter design around human anatomy and proportions. Torrey especially prominently features human bodies and faces in his typographical designs. His approach of using human bodies as a guiding aesthetic for written language epitomizes the Renaissance's humanistic approach that allowed readers to see typography in closer relationship to themselves as the hand press period ushered in unprecedented levels of textual production and print's hegemony began to rise. Many scholars have discussed humanist typography in the context of standardization and essentialism, conforming typographical forms to a specific set of human anatomical proportions inherently links the ideal body to the ideal book. While this is certainly correct, I think there's a competing way to read some of these moves. For Pacioli, Da Vinci, and Torrey, this was a project in the book arts, a way of pressing themselves into the objects that were important to them. As someone who's also made books and attempted to design typefaces, it's a surprisingly intimate and personalized experience. That sentiment is echoed by the students I work with in my courses and in book lab, and that experience has helped me reframe these books, traditionally viewed as typographical manuals, as a kind of artist book that have just as much to say about identity as they do typography. While the early modern period failed spectacularly to develop coherent ideologies about equality and human rights, humanism embraced the diversity of the human experience and typographical forms designed around embodied human figures urged readers to develop their own unique feelings and relationships to print typography, as the idiosyncrasies of manuscript hand began to be replaced by new replicable forms. Torrey's terming of his typography book, Champfleury, or Field of Flowers, plays into some of these reproductive metaphors. That is, print typography isn't necessarily standardized, but rather queerly reproduced from different shapes and molds, each with their own unique identities and personalities, reaching out to the uniqueness of their readers in a growing print marketplace. And if you'd like more on typographical reproduction, you should consult Joseph Moxon's 1683 Mechanic Exercises, which is borderline pornographic in its discussion of typecasting and printing, and Lisa Maruca has some great scholarship on that. This interest in inserting the self in typographical forms recalls a recent book arts project by artist Sonia Clark named Twist. While Pacioli, Da Vinci, and Torrey conceptualized typography exclusively through white male figures, Clark created a hair-based font which, quote, challenges the cultural supremacy of the Roman alphabet and resists the European dominance inherent in its widespread use, end quote, by shaping letter forms with her own DNA-rich strands of African hair. In addition to designing the font, she also had it cast as metal letterpress type, further challenging the Western claim to movable type, and using her font to reflect her embodied existence. Twist is an example of how intimately typography can be connected to notions of the self. Just like the book arts, bibliography and book historical scholarship are embodied practices. While the relationship between the book arts and bibliographical methodologies is not new, nor is it novel to think about how queer theory influences book arts and various other maker and craft movements. I'm thinking particularly of exhibitions that have been shown here at the Center for Book Arts on Queer Identity, such as the Queer and Biblio Object exhibition in the past. Work that explores these relationships, the relationship between all three of these components, is currently underdeveloped. Who we are as people is just as important as who we are as scholars or book artists. Bibliography should lean into the affective registers of these spaces to think about the importance of identity, rather than seeing ourselves as detached scientists just looking at objects we have no emotional attachment to, or objects that have their own ideological stakes, as many foundational bibliographical texts urge us to do. As Sargon states, we are purposely ignoring important critical frameworks when affect and identity are ignored in bibliographical scholarship, and they're often important components in the production of the texts themselves. This is what I've learned through my work in a book arts makerspace, and it's deeply influenced the work that I do as a bibliographer. Thank you. And I'm going to hijack a couple seconds before Caden's talk to encourage people in the audience to submit to the second annual conference on queer bibliography, which is being hosted this year by UCLA's California Rare Book School, and that's taking place from July 25th through the 27th. The proposal deadline's coming up soon, though I think it's going to be extended, so if you're seeing February 1st and that freaks you out, I do think that's going to be extended. So if you are interested in submitting, you can email queerbibliography@gmail.com, abstracts, typical link, but we'd love to see you there. It's going to be a great conference. Thanks.
And while I hope you can hear me while I'm switching over to my slides. I just want to second one, my thanks and appreciation to Colleen and Aaron and the Center for Book Arts, and for my friends and colleagues who are on the panel, and also encourage you to submit to Queer Bibliography. It was by far one of the most important academic conferences of my career. It's where I found my people. And so if you're still looking for your people in book arts and book history, I really want to encourage you. The community was such a vital part of that experience. Without further ado. All right, okay. And I want to quickly preface here that this talk is very much an early work in progress and a bit of an experimentation for me with prose, which is to say, quoting my companion Walt Whitman, "I give you fair warning before you attempt any further. I am not what you suppose, but far different." Embodied knowledges in the press room, or a waltz with Walt. 1, prelude. The press room is a sensorium. It is filled with the smells of inks and solvents and sweat, the click of type hitting the composing stick, the weight of the form as it is moved to the bed of the press, the feel of paper in my hands, the silky hiss of ink on the brayer, the clicks and clanks of presses, the body's exertion at pulling the bar of the hand press, or the legs kicking of the jobbing press. And in these ways, and many more, printing is a sensual practice in that it engages my senses, bringing me into an awareness of my body, often in pleasing ways. And indeed, the press room is where I go when I want to assume a body. After years of being in contention with my own body, it is where I go to be reminded not only that I have a body, but that a body, and my body specifically, can also be a site of pleasure. Because of this sensorium, I would even go so far as to echo gay printer Richard Gabriel Rummans, that for me, printing is an erotic experience. Printing is an erotic experience in that it is, as Audre Lorde contends, quote, a measure between the beginnings of our sense of self and the chaos of our strongest feelings, an internal sense of satisfaction to which, once we have experienced it, we know we can aspire, end quote. But it is also erotic in that it makes possible a trans-temporal companionship with others mediated by embodied practice. In my own practice as an artist scholar, I am interested in exploring and understanding the body's place in the press room and in relation to others, particularly those others located in the past. And while there is already a wealth of scholarship on the labor practices of print shops, I take a slightly different approach by seeking to understand printing as an embodied practice, how these practices are transmitted across space and time, and perhaps most importantly, how we are put into intimate contact with others through these embodied practices. 2, notation. I am sitting in the skeuomorph press and book lab with a stack of type cases in front of me. Healy Kester, our newest printer's devil, sits across the table with another stack of type cases. The finger-picking bluegrass stylings of Winifred Raymond is playing on the portable speaker as the smell of burnt wood from the industrial laser cutter in the next room wafts through our open door and the light outside is fading. We are sorting type into new cases, checking each sort to make sure that it gets in its appropriate compartment. We are doing this mostly in silence, not talking with each other as we maintain focus on the task at hand. Healy has a question, though, a question about our movements, about the rhythm of our movements and the pattern of gestures our bodies are making as our hands move to, from, and over the type cases, as we drop each sort into its proper place and with its own kind. We are talking about the movements as choreographic, about the relationship between bodies and print, and about how bodies retain and transmit knowledge across history. Healy sees a dance in our movements. I see a repertoire of movements that have accrued over time from the earliest days of printing to our current moment. Together we are thinking about how we might capture this information. So I sit down with a piece of tracing paper over a diagram of a California job case. And a copy of Walt Whitman's Leaves of Grass, something I am often prone to carry with me. I pick a favorite poem, To a Stranger, and I begin moving my pencil across the tracing paper from one letter on the diagram to the next, as I slowly spell out the words, punctuation, and spaces of the poem, creating an abstract web of lines. We are both immediately in love with this image and its ability to represent movement and the embodied act of composition. And we already understood this drawing as part of a longer history in choreographic notation. We also see a lot of potential for working with this information at a large scale to produce a body of work around this approach to notating a text's choreographic composition. Yet we need a more efficient and robust way of producing this data. Originally a computer science major, now thankfully an English major, Healy proposed using JavaScript to write a code that would allow us to visualize a text mapped out across a diagram of a California case, outputting a similar image to the one I have just drawn on tracing paper. We were talking now about an artist book. An artist book the size of a typecase, featuring a repertoire of these dance notations of choreographed composition accompanied by their texts, all produced through a shared embodied practice of typesetting. 3. Pas de deux. I like to daydream about meeting Walt Whitman under the double vaulted ceiling of Pfaff's Saloon near Broadway and Bleecker. Sometimes in this daydream, I am Peter Doyle. And sometimes I'm just a young man, perhaps the young man Walt writes of in A Glimpse, who is silently approaching and seating himself near that he may hold me by the hand a long while, amid the noises of coming and going, of drinking and oath and smutty jest. There we two, content, happy in being together, speaking little, perhaps not a word. Or perhaps not saying a word, but speaking a wholly different language, we share a dance in that dimly lit Rathskeller. And if you were to ask me how the good gray poet dances, I might quote back to you the Shangri-Las. Close. Very, very close. I think often about what it must have been like to be Walt's dance partner and companion, to be held so close that you can smell the herbage of his breast. I am not, however, Walt's only dance partner. In fact, he's had several companions. In the Trent collection of Walt Whitman material at Duke University are several sections of the printer's copy used for the 1881 edition of Leaves of Grass. Whitman's process for revising Leaves for this edition involved cutting up a copy of the 1876 Camden edition and annotating it with his revisions, marking changes in punctuation, titles, etc. As I reviewed these revisions in the Rubenstein reading room, I noticed that Whitman had written in blue pencil a word that I initially didn't think much about because the first time I encountered it, I thought it had just read Leaves. After viewing several different revised poems, however, I began to notice that the word, always written in the upper left-hand corner, changed about every 3 or 4 pages. So I went back and I took a closer look, coming to the conclusion that Whitman had written the last name of the compositor assigned to typeset that section of Leaves. This was most evident when I came to the name of Jones. Is this Jones perhaps the Charles H. Jones who is listed in an 1881 Boston City directory as a stereotyper and lived at 53 Federal, just a few blocks away from Rand Avery and Company, where the 1881 edition of Leaves was typeset and electrotyped under Walt's supervision? I can't help but wonder, what was Charles' relationship with Walt? Could he feel the heat of Walt's body as he stood nearby observing Charles' typesetting? Were they merely companions, or were they companions? After the day's work, did they ever share a drink, a meal, a bed? Did they ever share a dance in a dimly lit saloon? When he was conducting research on gay trans man Lou Sullivan, who I might add was also a typesetter and a printer, trans choreographer and dancer Sean Dorsey said that he meticulously hand transcribed Sullivan's journal entries from library archives, and that for Dorsey the process of writing Sullivan's words was an important part of embodying Sullivan's experience. As Max Crandall and Selby Wynne Schwartz have noted, Dorsey's reproduction of Sullivan's words, the act of writing as well as his movements and language, are gestures of connection and replication, allowing him to absorb the archive and embody it. Through Dorsey's act of hand transcribing Lou's diaries and my own practice of typesetting Walt's leaves, we are expanding archival methods that seek to challenge dominant models of historical knowing by reframing historical transmission as a bodily act. That's not to say that our archival work isn't already embodied, but a specific bodily act. We both understand embodied practice as epistemological. That is, embodied practices offer us a way of intimately knowing Lou and Walt through the traces of muscle memory left in the body. The body as archive, or the body archive, is thus, as Julietta Singh puts it in No Archive Will Restore You, an attunement, a hopeful gathering, an act of love against the foreclosures of reason. It is a way of knowing the body's self as a becoming and unbecoming thing, a scrambling time and matter, of turning toward rather than against oneself. And vitally, it is a way of thinking, feeling the body's unbounded relation to other bodies. So while the physicality of printing brings me into my body, there is something about typesetting Walt's words that undoes me. As I hold each erect body of type with its face and beard between my thumb and forefinger, placing it into the composing stick shoulder to shoulder with the other sorts so it can be taken to bed, be pressed and impressed upon, I am unbound across time and space in my relation to Walt, brought into intimate contact with his body, his gestures across a typecase, his thumb, like mine, resting in the bellied nicks of the type as it slides down the composing stick. In this embodied practice, this companionship with Walt through typesetting, his words become flesh, my flesh, and I am drawn into an intimate dance with him. And I'm drawn into an intimate dance with Charles Jones and with all of the other companions who have composed Whitman's words. And this dance with Walt is close, very, very close. So close that Walt is in me, in my body, in my movements as my hands pass over the typecases, and in the pull of the bar on the hand press. And I can't help but ask, whispering Walt's own words into his ear, is this then a touch, quivering me to a new identity? Thank you. Imagine some outro music of Whitney Houston's I Just Want to Dance with Someone.
Okay, before we open up questions to the audience,
Oh, yeah.
do you guys have questions for each other? And if not, I have like a gimme that I can throw.
Give it to us.
Okay. All of your talks focused a lot on embodiment and like the physical acts of doing things. Did you guys care about that before printing, or did printing like gesture you towards that?
I did not care at all.
Okay.
No, I fully thought when I started working on my dissertation project that I was going to be doing a project on women in science. I was fully not even going into the realm of like book arts and inscription and making. And so, yeah, I mean, when I started just doing it for fun, it just brought so many
new questions for me. Yeah.
Yeah, kind of the same answer, and like a lot of people talk about like how time consuming it is to set type, and that's certainly true, but like it's also just to like get the ink out and to clean up the ink and to do regular maintenance on the press, and if you've set something that's like fairly long, it's like really heavy on a galley tray or in the composing stick, just trying to move that around sometimes is like a really physically exhausting process. I trained my very first internship, I was on like a large Washington press, and I mean even just pulling the lever on that, it's a very like intentional, you're kind of utilizing your entire body to pull that lever, especially like safely so that it doesn't snap back and crack the iron on the press. So like I never really like, I thought about, you know, letterpress as a more time consuming process than the kind of digital world that I grew up in, but it was really, I hadn't internalized like how much you're engaging your entire body by typesetting until I started working more with printing.
So I started as a performance artist, which has served me very well for teaching. And in that, and I was doing endurance-based work, and so there are ways that I was thinking about the body and the endurance of the body, but I wasn't talking about it in those terms. And I intuitively knew something about, I often talked about books in bodily ways, like these are, to the like, we know these cliches at this point about bodies as open books and reading people. And so I intuitively knew that there was something there, and I went into printing, wanting to learn a skill that would serve me well in my research in 19th century print history and book history, and was kind of, even though I knew that it was an embodied practice, I was kind of unprepared for the degree to which it would affect me. After like several years of being away from doing sort of like body-based performance work, to sort of like re-enter art making through body-based work, and then also like make me I was in a very different place in my life, make me reconnect to my own body in ways that I hadn't foreseen. So I feel like for me, it was like always just like bubbling under the surface, waiting for a convergence of things to align. And then, of course, like most people who step into a print shop for the first time, the devil got in me, and it's hard to kick him out.
So there's a long tradition of bibliographic printing or making as an act of kind of historical recovery. So I'm thinking about people like Stanley Morrison or Dart Hunter, like using making as a way of understanding a historically embedded practice. And interestingly, that's not what any of you are talking about, like at all. You're talking about a really different kind of way of knowing, right? So I'm interested to kind of hear you talk about, I think there is a mode of recovery in what you're each speaking to, but it's a different kind of recovery than that sort of like, what is this historic practice and how can I replicate it and therefore understand it as a craft practice or in its historical context. So I just wonder if you guys could speak about like ways of knowing and what is recovered through these alternate ways of knowing.
I just don't want to like speak first, but I mean, I think for me, like, this project on Walt Whitman is, in one part, sort of recovering sort of the gestures, the movements that go into it, that seems like an easy thing to recover. But for me, the thing that I think is being recovered is a kind of intimacy.
Yeah.
That, and I think that that is a queer sort of approach, thinking about Carolyn Dinshaw and touching the past, and Heather Love work on looking backwards in a way that doing those gestures allows me to experience or feel perhaps like I might be experiencing something very similar to Wroth. And that puts me into a kind of intimate relationship with him. And so I think that there's a particular drive from a queer perspective to connect with queer figures in the past in ways that isn't necessarily just about recovering, like, oh, I can identify this person, but like to know them on a different, more intimate level, like, you know, typesetting Leaves of Grass, or to know that 18th century trans man John Taylor worked in a print shop, so when I'm setting type, I'm like, oh, John Taylor, 18th century trans guy is setting type in 18th century London, and we have this shared connection. Lou Sullivan worked in the 80s and was like doing digital typesetting, so slightly different. But he also talks in his diaries about how it's embodied and about how it operates as an extension of his body. And so that provides venues for being able to be in relation with people that you can't be recovered in one sense, but can be recovered through this kind of repertoire of performance and movement that allows us to be in a relationship with each other. And to me, that is like, that's what I want. That's what I'm hungry for. And if I recover some historical figures in the process, well, great. But for me, it's about having intimate relationship with the past.
Yeah, some of the kind of like conversations surrounding recovery, like whether it's when I'm working with students in book lab or in my own classes, is almost like a recovery of appreciation for physical media, and like really like thinking about like, again, like the book is an object, which is so central to bibliographical scholarship, but a lot of the students that I encounter in my classes or in book lab, I think sometimes don't like fully grasp like historically what that means until that they're working with their own like physical media, and that like if things aren't preserved they just disappear. And I think like sometimes they've grown up so much in like an internet culture where nothing ever goes away on the internet and things are duplicated all over the place on your computer, that some of the conversations about queer pulp novels from the 50s and 60s and why so many of them are completely missing and we'll probably like never actually read them again. Or when we did a unit on queer video games, there's one from the 80s that until a couple years ago when the creator had one in their desk that was able to be emulated, like that game was completely lost and nobody could play it. Like the idea of just even something as recent as the 80s being like already gone from the historical record, I think like because we've been doing so much with physical media and like really thinking about the physicality of the book arts, that those conversations were more productive to have with them than like, you know, librarians deal with this all the time, like, well, why can't you just digitize it? But like there's like so many like different conversations within that problem. And so I think like a lot of what I'm doing is trying to recover a sense of appreciation for like physicality and also like its limitations, and why the limitations are beautiful in their own way because they have like these physical embodied forms. And as I've seen in my classes, like students relate like their own body to like the kind of disappearance of some of these texts. So to me, like, yes, sometimes we're kind of like interested in teaching them historical practices like letterpress printing and explaining it like in context of, you know, the media revolution or not, you know, the Eisenstein-Johns argument. But and that's important and that's fun, and students sometimes get into that too. But what they really get into is sort of recovering like a sense of like what physical media even is and what role does physical media still play in the 21st century. And those are like really fun and engaging conversations with students.
This was such a great question, Liz. I just needed a moment to like collect myself. So I totally agree with both Caden and Dylan, and what Caden was saying about intimacy, I think is really what I'm also trying to do, because, and for me, it's thinking about how, especially early modern print culture has been so masculinized. It is such, like, bibliography is such a masculine field. Like, it is so rigid, it is structured and strictured, and there are assumptions about who belongs and who doesn't belong, and what we should analyze and who we shouldn't analyze, who we should exclude, and that means that women and the natural world become excluded from those discussions, despite being absolutely crucial to the production of books in that period, and also being completely erased from the historical record in many ways, because of masculinized power structures and the way governance is structured, and whose wills and court documents get preserved, and whose names get used, i.e. when a woman marries a man, she takes his name, and then she becomes widowed, and she marries another man, and then you lose track of her because her name is Elizabeth, like every other Elizabeth in the period. And not to make a remark on your name, I realize this as I'm saying this, but it was such a common name in the period, right? And so we very much lose track of all of these women who were actively participating in bookmaking culture, because of this masculinized way of, structuring knowledge and structuring society.